The cursor was blinking. That's all it did. Just blinked. Dale Whitmore was standing in the narrow back room of a farmhouse in central Illinois, staring at a green screen that was supposed to be pulling live grain prices from the Chicago Board of Trade. It was October 11th, 1985. Corn was moving. Not a little. It was moving in a way Dale had been waiting on for 3 weeks. He knew it because his brother-in-law called from town to tell him. The line had been working fine at 6 a.m. By 9 a.m., the modem had gone silent, and now, at 10:17 in the morning, during what should have been the most important data window of the entire harvest season, the screen just blinked. No prices, no moisture readouts from the bins, no connection to anything. The phone line was down. And that's when everything Dale Whitmore had built over the previous 18 months started to crack. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand what that blinking cursor meant, you have to understand what Dale was willing to risk to put it there in the first place. Let's go back to the spring of 1983. Dale Whitmore was 34 years old and farming 840 acres in Champaign County, Illinois. His father had farmed the same ground, his grandfather before that. But Dale was not the kind of man who confused tradition with wisdom. He read, he subscribed to 3 farm publications, he attended extension meetings when most of his neighbors skipped them. And in late 1982, he started hearing about something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Farm management software. Not just accounting programs, actual integrated systems that could pull real-time commodity prices, track moisture levels in grain storage, calculate basis movement against your forward contract positions, and tell you, with something approaching precision, when to sell and when to hold. Companies out of Indiana and Ohio were starting to sell these systems to large commercial operations. The hardware was expensive, the software was proprietary, but the logic was undeniable. Grain marketing had always been a guessing game wrapped in experience. You watched prices, you watched the weather, you listened to your elevator manager, and at some point you made a call on whether to sell at harvest or store and wait for a winter rally. Get it right, you added 30 to 40 cents per bushel to your bottom line. Get it wrong, you gave that same 30 to 40 cents away. On 840 acres, averaging 130 bushels of corn per acre, that spread was worth over $40,000. A year's income, won or lost on timing. Dale did not think of himself as a gambler. He thought of himself as a man who understood leverage. And when he read that these systems could track basis relationships between local cash prices and CBOT futures in real time, could alert you when the historical spread between your elevator's price and the December contract reached optimal selling conditions, he stopped thinking of it as technology and started thinking of it as insurance. In January of 1983, he drove to Champaign and sat down with a company called AgriComp Systems. They showed him the setup. An Apple II-based system with a custom interface, a 300-baud modem, and a subscription to an agricultural data feed out of Chicago. The feed pushed commodity prices, weather data, and freight rate indexes every 15 minutes during market hours. The moisture monitoring required sensors installed in each grain bin, wired back to a central unit that logged temperature and humidity continuously. The total system cost was $24,000. Dale had $9,000 in operating reserves. He borrowed the rest. He told his wife, Carol, that the loan payment was $340 a month. He did not tell her right away that he'd also agreed to a 3-year service contract that added another $180 a month. He told himself he'd tell her after the first successful season. He would later describe this as one of the 2 worst decisions he ever made. By the spring of 1984, the system was installed and running. And here is where the story gets complicated, because what happened next was not failure. What happened next was success. Real, measurable, documented success. Dale ran his first full planting season with the system tracking soil temperature data he'd never had access to before. He adjusted his planting schedule by 4 days based on field-level temperature averages the sensors were logging. His corn emerged more uniformly than any previous year. His soybean stand count in the north field, historically his worst field for consistency, came in at 98% of target. He couldn't prove the system did that, but he couldn't prove it didn't either. The grain storage monitoring paid for itself before harvest even started. In August, one of his 3 20,000 bushel bins developed a hotspot, a pocket of elevated temperature near the perforated floor that indicated either moisture infiltration or early spoilage. The system flagged it at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dale was out there with a flashlight by 3. He'd caught it early enough to aerate the bin and dry down the problem area before it spread. If he'd missed it, he was looking at potential spoilage on 8,000 to 10,000 bushels. At $2.90 corn, that was a $25,000 mistake he didn't make. By the end of 1984's harvest, Dale had used the price tracking system to execute 2 forward contracts and a basis contract at windows that, in hindsight, were almost perfectly timed. His corn averaged $3.04 per bushel against a county average that year of $2.81 ton. He moved 60,000 bushels. That 23-cent difference was $13,800 that came directly from better market timing. The system had cost him $24,000. In 18 months, it had arguably generated or protected well over $35,000 in value. Dale Whitmore told his neighbors at the co-op meeting in December of 1984 that he'd put a computer in his farmhouse and it was the best thing he'd ever done. Some of them nodded politely. A few asked questions. Most of them drove home thinking he'd lost his mind. And that's the first twist. Because Dale was right. The technology worked. The problem wasn't whether the system was good. The problem was what happened when Dale started trusting it completely. By the summer of 1985, something had shifted in the way Dale made decisions. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. It was gradual, the way most dangerous dependencies develop. He stopped calling his elevator manager every morning to check prices. He stopped watching the noon market report on the local TV station. He stopped going to the co-op on Saturdays, where men stood around and traded what they'd heard from other men who'd heard it from someone else. Why would he? He had a system that pulled CBOT prices every 15 minutes and displayed them on a screen in his house. He had bin sensors logging temperature and moisture continuously. He had a spreadsheet model, one he and the AgriComp technician had built together over 2 seasons, that tracked his break-even price against his outstanding operating loan, his storage costs per bushel per month, and the historical basis movement for his local elevator going back 7 years. The data was better than anything any of those men at the co-op had. He knew it, and quietly, without meaning to, he'd started acting like it. He stored more corn than he ever had before. Going into the fall of 1985, he had approximately 95,000 bushels of corn in his 3 bins, and had arranged to rent additional storage at a neighboring elevator for another 30,000. He was carrying 125,000 bushels into a market he expected to rally, based on his system's historical analysis of late-fall basis patterns. His outstanding operating loan at that point was $187,000. His land was leveraged to about 60% of market value. The annual debt service on everything, land note, operating line, equipment, and the AgriComp loan, was running about $38,000 per year. He needed corn to move at $3.10 or better to hit his target. The system was showing that window could come in mid-October. He was going to wait for the data to confirm it. Would you wait? With $187,000 borrowed and 125,000 bushels sitting in bins, would you wait for better data? Or would you sell at $2.95 and take the certain money? Dale waited. The phone line in Champaign County ran on infrastructure that by 1985 was already showing its age. This is the part of the story most people don't focus on when they talk about farm technology in the 1980s. They focus on the computers. They focus on the software. They talk about modems and data feeds and price screens. What they don't talk about is what those modems had to travel through to get their data. Rural telephone infrastructure in central Illinois in 1985 was managed by a patchwork of small regional carriers and a few cooperatives. The lines themselves, copper wire buried or strung on poles, had been laid in some cases decades before. The switching equipment at many rural substations dated from the 1960s and early 1970s. A 300-baud modem needed a clean, consistent analog signal to function reliably. What it usually got in rural Champaign County was something considerably less than that. Dale's system had dropped connection before. He knew about the problem. The Agricomp technician had documented the line quality issues in the spring of 1984 and had recommended that Dale contact Illinois Bell about upgrading the circuit to his property. Dale had called. Illinois Bell had sent someone to evaluate. The line engineer had written up a report recommending the work. The work had been scheduled twice, and twice it had been bumped for what the company called higher priority urban and commercial corridor work. As of October 1985, Dale's line had still not been upgraded. He knew the connection was fragile. He just didn't think it would fail on the specific day it mattered most. That is not stupidity, that is timing. October 11, 1985, corn on the CBOT hit $3.14 intraday. The December contract. By 10:30 a.m. Chicago time, the market was signaling a possible close above $3.10, a level Dale's model identified as his optimal forward contract execution window. Dale's system had gone offline at some point between 6 and 9 a.m. The exact cause was a corroded splice at a junction box about 2 miles from his property, common during the temperature swings of early fall. The repair crew wouldn't be dispatched until the following morning. Dale knew something was wrong with the connection. He did not know what was happening in Chicago. He drove to town. He got to the co-op at 11:15. The board was showing $3.11 cash corn, up 11 cents from the prior day's close. He asked to use the phone. He called his elevator. His elevator manager said the market was strong, that he'd already moved contracts for several producers that morning, that the window looked good. "You want to sell?" the manager asked. Dale said he'd call back. He wanted to check his model first. He drove home. His system was still offline. He drove back to town to use the phone again. He got back to the co-op at 12:40 p.m. The board showed 3.06. The market had rolled back. By 2 p.m. it was at 3.03. By the close of trading it had settled at $3.01. The $3.10 window had lasted approximately 90 minutes that morning. Dale had been in his truck. The line stayed down until October 13th. By then, corn had drifted to $2.97. That's when timing turned against him. Let's be precise about what that 90-minute window actually cost. Dale was carrying 125,000 bushels of corn. He'd been targeting 3 dozen tons. He ultimately moved the corn over 3 separate sales in late October and early November at an average price of $2.97. That 13-cent difference across 125,000 bushels was $16,250. That's not a devastating number in isolation, but it came directly off his ability to service debt. He'd projected a $42,000 gross income from that corn at $3.10 pricing. He got $31,000. After storage costs and interest on the operating line, his net was approximately $11,000 less than his model had projected. His annual debt service was $38,000. He could cover it, but just barely. The operating reserve he'd expected to rebuild going into 1986 didn't exist. He went into the 1986 season with no cushion. This is where the farm crisis mathematics started compounding against him. 1986 brought lower commodity prices, higher interest rates, and a drought in the eastern half of his operation. Dale Whitmore did not fail because of technology. He failed because he'd built a financial structure that required everything to go right. And when one critical system failed at one critical moment, the margin he'd counted on evaporated. By the fall of 1986, he was negotiating with his lender about restructuring the operating line. The lender, a regional bank out of Decatur, agreed to extend the term, but required Dale to liquidate the Agricomp system as a condition of restructuring. The monthly payment was too high for what they now assessed as a non-essential expense. Dale disconnected the system in November of 1986. He sold the hardware for $2,800. He let the service contract lapse. He spent the next 4 years farming with a legal pad, a radio, and a standing 9 a.m. call to his elevator manager. He survived. He didn't lose the farm, but he downsized. He sold 160 acres of rented ground he'd been managing to free up cash flow. He cut his stored grain position, never again carrying more than 40,000 bushels past harvest. He restructured twice more before his debt ratios finally stabilized in 1990. The vision didn't collapse. The structure that supported it did. Here's what makes this story worth telling in 1985 and worth understanding right now. Dale Whitmore was not wrong about the technology. Every specific function he'd identified, moisture monitoring, real-time basis tracking, systematic contract execution, was a legitimate improvement over what existed before. He'd proven it worked. In 2 seasons with reliable data access, his marketing decisions had generated measurable premium returns over county averages. The system was not flawed. The infrastructure it depended on was. A 300-baud dial-up modem needs approximately 4 seconds of clean analog signal to establish a connection. Rural phone lines in 1985 couldn't guarantee that on a cold October morning with corroded copper splices in a junction box 2 miles from the farmhouse, the data feed that Dale was subscribing to, $180 a month, was designed for urban commodity traders with dedicated commercial phone circuits that Illinois Bell maintained to a higher standard than the residential rural lines. Dale was paying for a tool built for a different environment and running it in an environment it wasn't designed for. He didn't know that when he bought it. The AgriComp salesman certainly didn't emphasize it. The line quality documentation existed somewhere in Illinois Bell's records, but it wasn't in Dale's contract. Is innovation still innovation if the system beneath it can't hold the signal? That's not a rhetorical question designed to make Dale look foolish. It's a structural question about technology adoption curves. Early adopters always face infrastructure gaps. The software moves faster than the wires. The vision moves faster than the county telephone maintenance budget. Dale was right about where farming was going. He was just early enough to carry the full cost of being right before the environment caught up. In 1991, Illinois Bell and GTE completed a regional infrastructure upgrade across 14 rural counties in central Illinois, including Champaign. The upgrade replaced corroded copper splices, upgraded switching equipment at 12 rural substations, and, most relevant to farmers by that point, enabled the 2400 baud and eventually 9600 baud connection speeds that made the next generation of agricultural software viable. By 1993, the AgriComp system Dale had sold for $2,800 had been replaced by commercial successors running on IBM-compatible hardware that cost half as much, delivered data 10 times faster, and were being adopted at scale across the Corn Belt. The precision agriculture tools that Dale Whitmore had been using manually, moisture monitoring, basis tracking, systematic forward contracting, became standard practice for mid-size operations across Illinois within a decade. The elevator manager Dale had been calling at 9 a.m. every morning eventually told him in 1994 that the large commercial producers were all using some version of the systems Dale had been running in 1984. Better hardware, faster lines, same logic. Dale heard that and drove home and sat in his kitchen for a long time. He wasn't angry. He told people later that what he felt was something closer to recognition. Like a man who'd been right about a direction but wrong about the road. The farm Dale's father built still exists. Dale's son runs it now, 640 acres, with a fiber optic connection to the farmhouse and a subscription to a cloud-based grain marketing platform that pulls live CBOT data at a 1-second refresh rate. The moisture sensors in the bins connect wirelessly to an app on his phone. When prices move, he gets a notification in approximately 4 seconds. It is, in almost every structural way, exactly what Dale Whitmore designed in 1983. Just running on infrastructure that finally exists. Dale is 76 now. He still farms a few acres on the home quarter, mostly to stay busy. He talks about the 1985 harvest with a kind of deliberate calm, the way people talk about things they've had decades to process. "The system was right," he said once. "I was right about what it could do. I just didn't account for the wire." The wire, 2 miles of aging copper running from a junction box on a county road to a farmhouse in Champaign County. That's what stood between Dale Whitmore and the vision he'd borrowed $15,000 to build. Not the software, not the hardware, not his decisions, not his intelligence, not the market. A corroded splice in a box that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Here's what this story actually teaches, and it's not about technology being dangerous, or debt being evil, or ambitious farmers getting what they deserve for reaching too far. None of that is true, and none of that is the point. The point is this: Dale Whitmore understood the future of his industry correctly. He adopted the right tools. He used them well. He generated real documented returns when the system functioned. His instincts were sound, his analysis was solid, his discipline was real. He failed, partially, temporarily, because he built his financial structure on an assumption of reliable infrastructure that didn't exist where he lived. He priced the software right. He priced the hardware right. He didn't price the risk of a rural phone line going down during a 90-minute price window on a Tuesday morning in October. Fixed costs don't care why the data didn't come through. The banknote is the same whether the modem connected or not. That's the lesson. Not that innovation is reckless. Not that technology fails farmers. The lesson is that technology doesn't fail because it's wrong. It fails when the ground isn't ready. Dale's ground wasn't ready. Not the soil was fine. The infrastructure underneath the innovation, the wires, the substations, the maintenance budgets of a regional telephone cooperative that had more urban commercial priorities than rural residential ones. That's what wasn't ready. And if you're sitting right now with a technology decision in front of you, something that looks right, something where the math works, something where every analysis says go, the question worth asking before you sign is not whether the tool is good. The question is whether the environment around it is ready to hold it. Because the tool can be perfect, and the timing can still turn against you. If this story made you think differently about how risk actually works, not just financial risk, but structural risk, infrastructure risk, the invisible systems underneath the decisions we think we're controlling, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one: farmers who were right and got there too early, farmers who were wrong and survived anyway, stories where the villain isn't a banker or a drought or a bad price year, but something as ordinary and invisible as a corroded wire in a junction box on a county road. Drop a comment. I want to know, have you ever had the right idea at the wrong time? Have you ever built something that worked perfectly until the one thing you couldn't control gave out? That's what this channel is about. Real decisions, real consequences, real lessons from people who lived them. And share this with someone who's about to make a big technology investment. Not to scare them, just to make sure they've asked the right question. It's not whether the tool works, it's whether the ground is ready.